thank you all so much to those who have joined so far. We're going to give it just a couple more minutes to allow more attendees to join us, and then we'll begin our discussion. All right, well, why don't we go ahead and get started? Again, thank you for joining us for an evening with the experts, ending private ownership and exploitation of big cats. This is an issue that's been a priority for IFAW for some time, and so I'm thrilled that there's interest in learning more about what all of us can do to better protect large felids. For the past 50 years, IFAW has worked to protect individual animals, animal populations, and habitats all over the world. We provide hands-on assistance to animals in need, whether transporting captive animals to true sanctuaries, rehabilitating wildlife, or rescuing animals in the wake of natural disasters. Protection of and advocacy for big cats, both in captivity and in the wild, has long been a priority for us, and I appreciate this opportunity to share that work with you today. We have some fantastic speakers and experts with us today. Sharon Guynup is an accomplished investigative journalist who revealed the role of Thailand's tiger temple in the wildlife trade, and more recently did an in-depth examination of US captive big cats, breeders and dealers across the US. Tammy Thies is with us today as well. She's the founder of the Wildcat Sanctuary, a true sanctuary for big cats in Sandstone, Minnesota. She provides these live felids with a safe home and lifetime care, and takes care of cougars, tigers, lynx, and other wildcats rescued from dangerous and inhumane circumstances. Meredith Whitney is with us as well. She's a program officer with IFAW's animal rescue team, leading projects on rescuing big cats in captivity in the US and the rehabilitation of leopards in Kenya. She's also responded with our disaster response teams to provide care for wildlife and domestic animals impacted by natural disasters. In addition, before I hand things over to our speakers today, I want to encourage those of you who are interested in following this discussion online and on social media to check out our Twitter account, which has been taken over by IFAW ambassador and big cats advocate Elizabeth Brentano. You can check that out and be involved in the conversation at IFAW Global. So what we'll do is have the panelists go through the discussion, get into their expertise and their experiences in rescuing and protecting big cats across the US. And then we'll delve into a question and answer section. Please feel free to submit your Q&A using the Q&A function, and we'll save those until the end and then dive in. With that, I'd like to hand things over to Sharon Guynup, again, a well-respected journalist and expert on big cats.
Hello, everyone. I wanted to tell you that my introduction to the issue of captive tigers in the US actually came from work in Thailand. So, later speakers are going to discuss more about tigers in the US, but my role here this evening is I would really love to talk about what I've learned in reporting on tiger conservation over the past 2 decades. And I'd also like to discuss the link between captive tigers and the illegal international tiger trade. In Thailand, I did my first reporting on captive tigers. Up until then, it had been wildlife ecosystems and the threats that face wild tigers. And I'll circle back later to the US. In 2015, a source named Sybil Foxcroft contacted me and told me that tigers were being sold into the illegal wildlife trade from a place called the Tiger Temple. It was a Buddhist monastery that doubled as a tiger sanctuary and a tourist attraction where you could pet and bottle feed cubs. You can interact with adult tigers, and tourism brought in $3 million a year. That call launched a year-long investigation with photographer Steve Winter, and we ultimately uncovered evidence of tigers, both dead and alive, being smuggled into the Asian black market trade, which violates both Thai law and the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species, CITES, which is a treaty that's been signed by 183 nations regulating that trade. So when National Geographic published our story in January 2016, dozens of media outlets covered it, and it sparked an outcry. The Thai Environment Ministry was inundated with letters, emails, and calls from both Thai citizens and people around the world. And under pressure, 4 months later, officials raided the monastery. They seized all 178 tigers and closed it down. What they discovered inside was macabre. They found tiger skins, including one hanging in the abbot's house, and 40 dead cubs in the kitchen's industrial freezers, and 20 more preserved in glass jars. Similar jars were later confiscated in Vietnam on the Chinese border. The raid on the Tiger Temple became a global news story. It was a light bulb moment for many about the reality behind hands-on contact with wildlife, which I want to note is the hard line on whether a wildlife attraction is ethical. But that story was not just about one corrupt monastery. It's important to understand that these venues feed and stimulate sales on the black market. This undermines conservation efforts by driving the poaching of the last wild tigers. Tiger parts are worth a lot of money, and wild tigers are worth more than captive bred cats. China is by far the largest consumer, and demand has shifted from traditional medicine to exotic luxury products. Gifting or hanging a tiger pelt or serving vintage tiger bone wine is the equivalent of wearing a Rolex watch. It's a status symbol among China's elite. About 6,000 tigers are grown on tiger farms in China and also raised in Thailand, Laos, and Vietnam. Many venues, like the Tiger Temple, front as tourist attractions or zoos. Now, it's important also to know that poaching for the international wildlife trade is now the greatest threat to survival of wild tigers, and they are the most endangered big cat. Just 4,000 wild tigers remain. And this illegal trade is run by the same transnational syndicates who deal in drugs, guns, and human trafficking. And that trade is now considered one of the most lucrative illegal businesses in the world, valued by the UN at somewhere between $19 and $24 billion a year. Now, the US has been a leader in the fight against wildlife trade. For example, in 2015, the US negotiated a bilateral ban with China on domestic ivory sales. But with tigers, we have absolutely no credibility. One US conservation official told me he was laughed at by Chinese delegates when he raised the tiger farming issue. At least we know how many tigers we have, they said, and walked away. So it's now estimated that somewhere between 5,000 and 10,000 tigers are in captivity here in the US, with most of them bred for tiger cub petting tourist attractions. When Steve Winter and I launched a 2-year inquiry into US tigers for National Geographic, one of the big questions was, what happens to them when they reach their quote unquote expiration date at 3 or 4 months old? They're too big and dangerous to pet, and they're no longer bringing in money. We learned that some become breeders, like almost tiger mill kind of conditions. Some are illegally sold across state lines to roadside zoos. Many simply disappear. There's evidence that extras are killed to reduce inventory. The most well-documented example is Joe Exotic, who was convicted of killing 5 tigers to make space for more at Wynnewood Exotic Animal Park, which is still open and offering cub petting. Their vet also testified on the stand to euthanizing at least 100 tigers. So we discovered that CITES, that international treaty, is investigating 7 nations who may be feeding captive bred tigers into the illegal international trade. And believe it or not, the United States is on that list. U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service Special Agent Philip Land told me that exporting wildlife out of the U.S. is becoming more prevalent. Dead tigers have been stuffed or sold off in parts, skins, tiger tooth necklaces, and entire skeletons offered for sale online. The trafficking network has reached all the way to Asia. I found a recent case where a New York City dealer shipped 68 packages of wildlife parts to Thailand, disguised as ceramics and toys. And a court document listed the contents of 2 of them, which included tiger skulls, teeth, and claws. So there's one last point I want to make about conservation and US tigers. Every one of the dozens of roadside zoos and cub petting venues that Steve Winter and I visited claimed to be saving tigers. We went to dozens of venues. Most are registered nonprofits and brand themselves as sanctuaries or rescues, but they do not meet the criteria. Visitors are told they're contributing to conservation and they go home happy and post selfies on Facebook and Instagram. But it's simply untrue that they're contributing to conservation. There's no conservation value to tiger tourism. Not one captive bred tiger has ever been successfully released into the wild. And the reason is that once they're habituated to humans, they're drawn to human settlements. They prey on livestock, which is people's livelihoods, and they endanger humans. And even if it were possible to rewild these captive bred tigers, it wouldn't be these tigers. These tigers that are at US roadside zoos are inbred, unhealthy, crossbred mutts. Mutts meaning they're often Bengal, Siberian mixed breeds. They're also, heavily inbred. Most of the cats we saw in our cross-country investigation had obvious health issues, including crossed eyes, misshapen heads, crooked spines, and obvious neurological problems. And many of these venues also crossbreed lions and tigers to create animals that don't exist in nature. Ligers, tigons, and other mixes, all of which have health problems. And despite extremely lax enforcement, these cub petting venues that I investigated all had been cited for violations of the Federal Animal Welfare Act. Lastly, some venues say they contribute to conservation of animals in the wild. We found that one such entity, called RARE, affiliated with Myrtle Beach Safari, has donated as little as $3,500 to reputable conservation organizations. And then they've used that nonprofit's good name to promote their cub petting attraction. Let me finish by saying that numerous tiger conservation experts have told me that this largely unregulated tiger cub petting industry has global implications. They undermine efforts by the global community to address the greatest threat to wild tigers, poaching for Asia and China's high-end market in tiger products, and the tiger farms that feed animals into that trade. Tiger experts say that the only way to save wild tigers is to cut the demand for tiger products, address captive breeding issues, and protect them in the wild. Thank you for signing on to join us this evening.
Thank you so much, Sharon. That was fantastic. And I think really underscores the confusion that pseudo sanctuaries and roadside zoos like to reinforce with respect to conservation and the conservation myths that we so often see as obstacles to properly protecting tigers here in the US as well as abroad. I should note for our attendees that we will, when we follow up with you, share links to Sharon's phenomenal pieces in National Geographic and elsewhere, where you can also see some of the beautiful imagery that she's mentioned from noted photographer Steve Winter. So thank you again for that, Sharon. That's fantastic. like Sharon said, there is an ongoing issue with captive big cats here in the US, which she examined during her sort of tour and investigation of various facilities across the nation. What we've done with our partner sanctuaries is work to rescue, when possible, as many of those animals as we can and provide them transport and other care at lifetime sanctuaries, legitimate facilities that meet high animal care standards. And so with that, I'll pass it over to Meredith Whitney, who leads IFAW's animal rescue work and has really been on the ground leading and helping to make a difference for these animals as we save them.
Hey, thanks, Carson. I'm going to try to share a slideshow with you all. Yes, that's the screen I want. Hold on. Share, there we go. You guys got that slideshow up? Okay, great. So IFAW is committed to ending the exploitation of captive wildcats and has been since our first rescue of 24 tigers in 2003. To do that, we focus on two areas. We improve the welfare of captive big cats, and we fight for policy reforms that will make private ownership of big cats and cub petting illegal. Oh, I just went through a bunch. Hold on. There we go. So the first thing for rescue is we do responses to captive big cats in the US that are in need for whatever reason, whether they're in abusive or neglectful situations, whether their owners have decided to surrender them, or whether the state has gone in and said, we're going to confiscate these animals for a variety of different reasons. IFAW can be there to help on the ground to rescue those cats and move them to legitimate sanctuaries in the US. The other thing that we do sometimes is we will provide financial support for rescues if we cannot be there on the ground ourselves, or if some of our sanctuary partners need additional financial assistance. Because remember that these sanctuaries that are doing this work and that are taking these animals and caring for them for a lifetime are nonprofits. They do not receive money from the government in any way. They're dependent on donations to do the good work they do. The other thing that we do is that we work to improve the care of captive big cats in the US, mostly in legitimate sanctuaries. So we have worked with our partners to come up with nutrition guidelines and feeding best practices, which we distribute actually worldwide to facilities that need the information. Since 2013, we've been hosting workshops and conferences for legitimate sanctuaries, collaborating to improve living facilities. And you can see in the image here, actually, this was a recent conference where we visited the Wildcat Sanctuary, Tammy's facility. We had sanctuary owners from across the country come so they could see how Tammy runs her operation and some of the best practices that she's implemented so they can learn and they can share their best practices. And the other thing that we like to focus on at IFAW is sustainable solutions. We try not to be a temporary Band-Aid that when we go away, that the solution falls apart. So in 2017, IFAW brought together members of the legitimate big cat sanctuary community in the United States, and we all created the Big Cat Sanctuary Alliance. This is a nonprofit organization with now 17 sanctuary members and counting. And there are also partner members like IFAW and GFAS, the Global Federation of Animal Sanctuaries, that support the mission of these sanctuaries and support providing proper care to big cats in the US. Sanctuary members now collaborate directly to improve standards and practices and to streamline rescues. They also work on advocacy and improving financial sustainability of partner members. So the second part of the work that IFAW does on this issue is to try to create sound policy. You know, Sharon mentioned that there's maybe between 5,000 and 10,000 tigers in the United States. We just don't know. And one of the reasons we don't know is because only about 2/3 of states have laws regulating private ownership, and 4 states have no laws at all regarding keeping big cats as pets. Any individual can just go out and buy a tiger and keep them as a pet in the state, and no one's going to ask any questions about it. They never have to report on them. Whereas other states may require some permits or licenses that are enforced to different levels depending on the state. So in response to this, IFAW is promoting the Big Cat Public Safety Act. This was reintroduced in the House in 2019. It's endorsed by the Fraternal Order of Police, by the National Sheriff's Association, and it prohibits individuals without USDA licenses, so people who are not publicly exhibiting animals. It prohibits them from owning big cats. Now, we have put a grandfather clause in so people who have these animals can keep the ones they have, but they are not allowed to breed them and they're not allowed to acquire new ones. And then the other part of the bill is that it restricts direct contact between big cats and the public. So this means no more cub petting. Now, it doesn't prevent the breeding, but if there isn't the financial incentive to do the cub petting, there is no reason to do the breeding. So USDA licensed facilities, people that are already open to the public, will remain open, like AZA accredited zoos, but without the cub petting, which is really where the most of the abuse comes from. That bill has passed out of committee now, and it is in the House and waiting on a vote. I think that covers everything from me. I just wanted to share, where is it? There we go. I didn't share enough tiger pictures in my presentation, so I just wanted to share Daisy, who lives at Tammy's facility, the Wildcat Sanctuary. Daisy is actually my favorite animal there. She's one that IFAW assisted in the rescue of in 2017. Thanks, Carson.
Thank you, Meredith. I was trying to think of the best way to do a transition here to our next speaker, but I think Daisy has done a much better job than I possibly could. Like Meredith said, Daisy now lives a happy life at Tammy's facility called the Wildcat Sanctuary up in Minnesota. Tammy's been involved in the rescue of many, many big cats, some from very, very miserable conditions, some from entertainment. And they're among the lucky ones, the ones that did end up at true sanctuaries. And what we want to ensure is that eventually this type of rescue won't be needed anymore. But in the interim, we're so thankful to have sanctuary partners like the Wildcat Sanctuary to provide lifetime care, quality veterinary services, and other critical needs to these big cats. So with that, I'll hand it over to Tammy. Thank you so much, Tammy.
Hi, thank you for having me, and it's wonderful to be around this group of people. I want to talk a little bit today about the difference between accredited sanctuaries and pseudo sanctuaries, and to continue on Meredith, I need to use Daisy as my poster child. But it can be confusing for the public, and that is really something we have a challenge with. But the biggest thing we can educate people is that reputable sanctuaries do not buy, breed, trade animals. We never allow cub petting or any type of public interaction with our apex predators, no matter their size, with the public. We are a nonprofit, but so many of these roadside zoos are too, and they guise themselves under this educational entity. Sanctuaries that are reputable can be open to the public, ours is not. But the difference is sanctuaries do guided educational tours and always allow a chance for the animal to get off display, if that's what you want to call it. Sanctuaries do not require the animal to be seen by the people that are there. And so when you visit a sanctuary, you often might not see all their animals, which is a good thing because the animals are getting the choice of what they do. There's a big difference in what we do too, is that we have veterinary care. We're doing preventative veterinary care. And when I talk about Daisy and show you that, there's a difference with what we do versus just a few things roadside zoos do. We have trained staff. Safety, public safety is number one, and individualized care of the animals. It's not about a collection of animals. It's about Daisy the tiger is very different than Zeus the tiger. Their background, where they've been rescued from, their medical needs, it is all about an individual. And we know as a sanctuary community, we're a Band-Aid to the bigger problem Sharon talked about. But we really believe that they deserve our compassion and dignity since they've been born in captivity. And more important, their stories can hopefully change the laws and how the public views captive wildlife, and that we have to stop exploiting wildlife like that. You know, another thing is that it's just, we are not usually the second home. It is not usually that a roadside zoo's closed down and this animal's lived there for a year or two and then goes to this wonderful sanctuary. We're getting a very small population of the captive tigers and other wildlife that are out there in horrible conditions. We might be the fifth or sixth home. These roadside zoos are an under what I call kind of grown web. When you unturn one, you realize how connected they are to each other, how much breeding and selling has gone along. Pseudo sanctuaries sometimes have unwritten contracts with these cub petting operations. For example, I saw one at a zoo in Illinois that had posted on their Facebook, "It's your last day to come see this tiger cub for cub petting," announcing it was the last day. And then I saw another place that claims to be a sanctuary announce on their page, "Look at our new resident who will be joining us tomorrow." The reality is we all want to rescue and close down cub petting operations, but to have an unwritten contract to be a dumping ground so they can breed or even buy more just to do cub petting is perpetuating the problem. And so I want to take a moment to share the differences. When you go to a roadside zoo or a pseudo sanctuary, when those animals are young and healthy, it might not look that bad to you. You get so close to an animal that you kind of forget it's living in a 10 by 10 cage, which is amazing to me that people, if they get that close connection, they excuse everything else they see at that roadside zoo because the animal looks happy in the eyes of the human because that cat came up to that person, that cat interacted through the fence. That doesn't necessarily make a happy tiger. A happy tiger is acres and acres and acres of exploring in the wild, napping where it wants to, running in the grass, making its own decisions. So we have to sometimes take our human emotion out of what we think a happy animal is. And I think that's what reputable sanctuaries do, is no matter how difficult that decision is for us, whether it's quality of life, health, housing, we need to take ourselves out of the equation and look at what makes that specific animal happy. And so here's an example of Daisy. Daisy is a tiger that Meredith talked about, and she is a poster child for what happens. Daisy was actually bred at a facility in Ohio that supplies tiger cubs to high schools for football games. So she spent the first couple months of her life in a tiny cage around screaming fans, getting their photos, flashes everywhere. This place had, I can't even count how many years of violations. Luckily, Ohio finally shut this place down, but it is after a lot of breeding and a lot of cruelty and neglect. Daisy could have been rescued at that time, but she wasn't, just like others that were the former mascots. She actually then went to a place in Michigan that had over 52 USDA violations, had actually shot animals, tigers in the head the year prior because they had ringworm and he had not treated them and they were bald in the winter, evaded 4 inspections before he did that. And finally, that's where Daisy got to go. And she grew up in a tiny little enclosure and then went out to a bigger enclosure, a nice 20 by 20 with hard rock surfaces for her, not appropriate for a tiger. And we got a call because Daisy was not walking. She was roaring. She was sometimes self-mutilating. And they said that she had an inner ear infection. Then undercover footage said that she had chewed a bone and a bone went through to her brain. But never once was she taken off site, sedated, MRI or anything like that. So we picked up Daisy under the USDA. I know PETA had done investigations. IFAW helped us to pretty much, we were told to probably put her down. And so I want to show you footage of Daisy. Then I will, when we picked her up and brought her back to quarantine. And then I want to show you kind of what we did to help her and show you what she is today. And I think her case alone tells you the difference between a pseudo sanctuary, a roadside zoo, and a sanctuary that's going to put the needs of the animals first. So I'm going to try and share my screen. please have somebody speak in my ear if you cannot see this. This is a little bit of a longer video. I'll talk over a little bit of it.
Right. They done an MRI of her brain yet?
No, CT of her brain.
So this is her in quarantine trying to get up for a piece of food.
Oh, girl, just...
That's gonna be hard. You're gonna have to go the other way.
Trying to move, and she can't. And that roaring is not grumpy over food. That roaring is severe pain. When she does finally get up, you'll see she'll have a curvature of the spine. She's stunted. She's roaring what people thought was she was scared of things. This is a huge pain response in about a 2-year-old tiger, 18-month-old tiger. And she was on public display this way. She was seen by visitors this way. And I don't know how anybody could have been okay with that. So when we picked her up, we drove her straight to the University of Minnesota. We do have an on-site hospital, but we knew this was going to take the big guns and as many resources as possible. It took 3 visits to the University of Minnesota to diagnose this girl. There was, after watching that day in that video we spent with her, there was a discussion that euthanasia was the most humane option for her. What they found is there was inflammation in the spine. So most likely Daisy had an inflammatory response to that massive infection when that chicken bone went through her cheekbone and into her skull, and her body responded by overcompensated, which really caused what we call spinal meningitis, probably one of the most painful things an animal or human can experience. She also had a broken back heel that had never been treated. So when she even tried to walk, her heel was broken. She had ringworm that was dormant, but of course, as we treated her with anti-inflammatory, we had to treat that. And she had continuing neurological symptoms. So this is Daisy after treatment. And this is Daisy not in her, this was actually a temporary habitat because she had to be confined for a little bit. But this is Daisy after being treated. And we know as sanctuaries, we can never give them back the wild. And that is something we are humbled by every day. But we do know that we can make them have a life that's wild at heart here in captivity. So I'm trying to get back to Zoom. There we go. And today Daisy celebrated almost her 3rd birthday and had a pool party. But it just shows you that at where she lived for almost 2 years, she couldn't get the treatment. And all they kept saying is they're trying by giving an animal an antibiotic that is in that much pain is not trying. So I just want to thank this whole team here before we open up for questions to say it took almost everybody, what I see in this panel and even more, to give Daisy the home that we give here at the Wildcat Sanctuary. So I have confidence that we are moving in the right direction and that we can all together end the big cat crisis. And I'll turn it over to you, Ms. Carson.
Thank you so much, Tammy. Yeah, Daisy really provides a great example and is emblematic, I think, of many of the animals we see rescued from difficult situations. I guess something that's come up a lot, and I know we've discussed it a little bit so far, but in the wake of more public attention being paid to these issues of big cats and sanctuaries, I've seen the question raised over and over, well, why can't we put them back into the wild? If tigers are so imperiled in their natural range, why are we keeping them in cages at all? Even if we're keeping them at legitimate sanctuaries where they're getting quality care, why not just transport them into their natural range and release them there?
So Sharon had touched on the fact that there's genetic issues to start with, that a lot of these are hybrids. So instead of, you would want to release a Bengal tiger in India, you'd want to release an Amur tiger in Siberia. You don't, what do you do with a hybrid that's not adapted to either place? There's no place for it. So that's a genetic issue that we to deal with. But the other issue that you have to deal with is when we rehab tigers for release to the wild, or when we rehab any captive bred animal for release, or an animal that has been taken out of the wild and is being rehabilitated for release, it is vitally important that they do not become dependent on humans, that they do not see humans as a source of food, as a source of comfort, as an ally or a friend. And you can't do that when you have a tiger that has been hand-reared and trained to depend on humans for food. You put that animal back in the wild, best case scenario is that it starves slowly to death. The worst case scenario is that while it's doing that, it travels into a populated area and injures a human being as well. And then it gets killed for that. So there's just not a good solution for these animals, and there's no way to return them to the wild.
Thank you. That's an excellent point. Yeah, like I said, I think that's something that oftentimes people don't understand, and why it's so essential that both we have legitimate sanctuaries to help care for animals suffering right now, and work toward a permanent solution where we can stop this trade from harming these animals in the first place and bring an end to it. I'll run through a couple more questions and then turn it over to the broader group. I'd love to hear more about the mechanics of a rescue. Maybe Tammy and Meredith, you can both speak to this. Not only all the logistics and work and partnerships that go into it, what kind of costs you're looking at when you go to rescue an animal, and what kind of burden we as charities are taking on as the result of somebody's irresponsible choice to, get a pet tiger.
I'll begin, and Meredith can chime in. So there's a lot of variance in rescues. So there's an owner surrender, which might be a little simpler, but even an owner surrender comes with complications, because even though the owner might have given that breeder upwards of $5,000, they don't want to give a sanctuary a surrender fee. And obviously we don't require it, because it's about public safety and getting that animal into a true sanctuary. So we have to drive across country. We have to staff to do that. We have to get health certificates. We might have to get import paperwork and export paperwork depending upon the state, or if it's an international rescue. We have to have a veterinary of record for a state to be able to do any immobilizations, which is sedation. If that animal can't be moved, obviously there's liability involved. So even one owner surrender, sanctuaries, it's what we do, so we understand it very well. But on bigger cases, Meredith can take you through that. There is so much logistics once you get legalities involved, and if it's a seizure or a closure. And I think the biggest challenge is not only once you're on site, all the coordination for public safety and how much people don't realize it takes, but the bigger thing is how slow the wheels of justice turn, and how many months to years you might be working on a cat in advance. And then I'll turn over Meredith, but the one other thing is people don't always know is that the mechanics of the rescue, sometimes we house animals that the legal case is not done. Sanctuaries are not only financially, can cost upward of $10,000 a year to care for a big cat appropriately. Roadside zoos will laugh at that number, and that's the scary part, right? If they can care for a tiger for $500 a year, that tiger is not getting proper care. But sanctuaries also house what we call witness protection program cats that the legal system has not finalized yet. And many times we're absorbing 100% of that cost and not ever being able to share that animal with the public. So there's no fundraising with that animal, there's no story, but we're doing what's right for the animal. So Meredith, I'm gonna turn it over to you for kind of the larger scale mechanics. We play a part in it, but you guys play a great role in it too.
Yeah, so for large rescues where you have maybe, scores of cats that are being moved, it's likely that you're not going to have one sanctuary that's able to take all the animals. So you have to bring in multiple sanctuaries. In some cases, you're dealing with law enforcement. We've seen many cases where owners have made credible threats against anyone that comes to take their cats. They've made threats against the cats themselves if anyone comes to try to take them. And so law enforcement, may be serving the warrant, but then also while they're serving that warrant, They need to make sure that they're getting that owner out of the way, or make sure that they are not going to be presenting a threat to the rescuers. And when they go onto the property to secure the property, one of the concerns other than the owner is, how secure are those cats? Some of these places have very dilapidated enclosures, very unsafe enclosures. And when a cat has grown up in those closures since it was a cub, it may have reached the point where it can escape, but it hasn't tried in a long time. Once you bring in this new scenario where you have all these strange people coming in and all this activity, that cat may get agitated and try to get out and discover that, gosh, look at that 6-foot wall isn't enough to keep me in. So now you're putting all your first responders at risk, you're putting all your rescuers at risk. So the sanctuaries have a role there in coming in and giving their expert opinion to law enforcement on what's safe for them to go into and what's not. So once you get that handled, then you need to go and get an inventory. A lot of times we don't know what animals are on site or what condition they're in. Then you prioritize what animals are going to move in what order. What are your top priorities? What are the safest ways to get them out? We've seen facilities where there were not even doors into enclosures, as in there was literally no way for anyone to ever come in or out of that enclosure, except including the animal. So no cleaning, no water changing, throwing the food over the fence. So how are you going to move that animal? How are you going to get it out safely? Wow, I'm trying to run through the whole list in my mind. So we have our equipment checklists we go through. We have our planning checklists we go through. We get everyone on the same page and coordinated. We go in. We have the logistics on the day of, coordinating the vet, coordinating the law enforcement, getting the safety officers in, getting communications officers in, getting all the sanctuaries on a schedule to go in and load their cats. How are we going to provide food for everybody? If it's a multi-day endeavor, where are people going to go to the bathroom? Where are they going to sleep at night? And so that's what goes into a rescue. And I know I'm leaving things out because I'm doing this top of the head right now, but it's big and it's complicated and it's difficult. And when you allow these people to stockpile animals in dangerous and abusive situations, it becomes dangerous for all of the people that are involved and all of the people in the community in case an animal gets out too.
Oh, Sharon, you're on mute. You want to unmute yourself?
I'd like to chime in. The very first thing that I did when I was working, began working on this U.S. tiger story, in February 2017, we participated in the last leg of what was the largest tiger rescue, I think, in U.S. history. 75 tigers from a venue called Serenity Springs Wildlife Center in Colorado were relocated to 15 sanctuaries across the country. And, I went, to Serenity Springs. This was orchestrated by, Scott and Tanya Smith of Turpentine Creek Wildlife Center, I believe it's called, in Arkansas. The owner had retired, and meanwhile, he'd been, the list of citations from USDA were appalling. And when they went into that situation, they literally called that place a horror show, quote unquote. The air was black with flies, rotting garbage everywhere, dead animals floated in the animal pools, enclosures were like shin deep in horribleness. And the animals were in such bad shape. And one tiger was missing a leg from fighting with a cage mate. Another had a softball-sized tumor on his neck. Many had broken abscessed teeth. Many of them limped from declawing. And most people don't understand that that's a procedure that removes claws by amputating the first joint of their toes, like amputating this much of our finger. And then there was this litter of 4-month-old white cubs that had such horrible spinal issues that they couldn't even drag themselves to their water bowls. They were young enough that with medical care and pain medication for life, they were able to rehab. And I've seen them as adults frolicking and running around. But I just wanted to give people a sense of the horror that some of these animals live in, and, you know, what the logistics are. Again, you know, as you mentioned, Meredith and Tammy, you know, relocating 75 tigers to 15 sanctuaries.
Yeah, and it can't be done overnight. And I just wanted to point out too, those cubs that you're talking about, the reason they couldn't walk was they had a condition called metabolic bone disease, which is a result of them not receiving proper nutrition. And it's likely that that was done because we know that they were used for cub petting. We have the pictures of advertising that you could come and have playtime with those cubs. That it's likely that they were either, the formula was watered down to keep them smaller longer so that they would appear young enough to be able to be legally used for cub petting, or it was watered down so that they could be fed longer throughout the day, because if they get full, then there's nothing for the tourists to do with them, right? So you gotta keep them hungry so that people can use them, and that resulted in these basically fractured bones and pelvis that were preventing them from walking. And Turpentine Creek has done an amazing job with those cats, and they are up and running around now.
Yeah, and I'll add one thing is there isn't a sanctuary that doesn't have animals from the cub petting trade. And what's sad is when you talk about, we go in and picked up, you know, Turpentine Creek did an amazing job and we were one of the receiving sanctuaries. We took 4 tigers from that rescue. When you look at 75 tigers, you have to remember they were all breeding tigers. So 75 seems overwhelming. How many were produced and where did the rest go? Only 75 breeding tigers when you have, and when we were on site, this is how prolific the breeding was there. When we were on site, just for the short hours we were removing our tigers, 2 tigers were giving birth and we heard screaming. And that's just how much of a puppy mill, we call them tiger mills, this was. Yet it was an open to the public place before that rescue, and the public got to hold a tiger cub, and the public overlooked all those 20 by 20 foot, 8 foot high pens. And we can't vilify the public, but we need to give them the facts that all of you have to make better decisions. Because if they knew what the truth was, those children and those parents would not want to do cub petting. I kind of always say it's like Santa Claus was great, we all know, but circuses, when children started learning about how circus animals live, children didn't want to go to circuses, and now we have Cirque du Soleil. So we just have to take the veil off of what cub petting really is, and I'm hoping the public will start making better decisions.
That's such a great point, Tammy. I always try to tell people that if you already have that tiger selfie, just, you know, take it down off your Instagram or your social media and explain why you did it. A lot of the cub handling businesses take advantage of people who are already inclined to care about animals. They're told they're doing something good for the animals, that they're supporting conservation of those animals' wild counterparts. So I think you make such an excellent point that this isn't meant to be a guilt trip for unknowing consumers. All we can all do is just make sure we're better informed, do everything we can to make the right consumer choices, and also ask our legislators to do the same by supporting the Big Cat Public Safety Act. Okay, I'm looking at some questions here, some really good ones. So this is, I think, this is actually directed at Sharon, since you've done this amazing investigative work, but I think it's probably a good question for all of you. Have you ever felt unsafe in the course of your work doing investigations or dealing with these sort of tiger breeders, dealers, and others involved in this sort of nefarious system?
Yes. For the first 18 months that we're working on this story, Steve Winter and I were undercover. Now, what that means for a reputable media outlet is that you don't have to say what you're doing or where you're from, but you can't lie about it. So if we were asked, we would have to reveal ourselves. But we went in as tourists and, you know, traveled around to dozens and dozens of roadside zoos and cub petting venues. One thing that comes up regularly is that there are threatening signs at many of these venues because, you know, PETA, the Humane Society, many others have done undercover investigations into, you know, animal abuse, animal welfare, and illegal, you know, interstate sale and trafficking of tiger cubs. It's an endangered species. That's it's against the law to do so, to sell them across state lines. And there were places where there was, signs about, you touch our, animals and you will be shot. And it was all that, kind of signage, which, made us very, very uncomfortable. So I started doing background checks on many of the owners and workers at some, especially the larger cub petting venues, but many others as well. I was really surprised to learn that, more than 90% of the venues I looked into, people owning or working those venues had criminal backgrounds. And it was everything from assault and battery, gun charges, drug, alcohol, and that made me even more nervous. After our story published in the December issue of National Geographic, we did receive some threats, which we monitored carefully. Nothing happened. But you have to realize that in order for this industry to operate, there is criminal activity, because not every venue gets cubs at the moment they need them. Meaning that network that Tammy mentioned, of breeders, petters, traders, they are shipping cubs around all the time. And at the very least, they are violating the Lacey Act, which prohibits, sale of an endangered species. As we saw, with Joe Exotic's trial, I sat through the trial and went back for the sentencing. There's lots of other illegal activity as well. I mean, Joe was convicted of killing 5 tigers. He was convicted of falsifying government documents saying that, those animals he was shipping across state lines were donated. So, again, hiding money. There is a current investigation into a venue in Indiana that has lost its USDA license recently, a place called Wildlife in Need. The Attorney General of Indiana is investigating Wildlife in Need for possible tax fraud, for claiming they were a nonprofit when actually being a for-profit industry. So it's kind of a long answer to that question, but if I was a parent bringing a young child to one of these situations, even if I didn't know about the cycle of breeding, petting, dumping, abuse involved in the industry, I'd be very concerned about the people that are running these venues. Again, as we saw in Tiger King, anyone who saw it, the people that were profiled in that series just raised some real questions.
Yeah, I think that a lot of the people that, cub petting operations can be hundreds of thousands of dollars a year in profit. And I think that a lot of these people that run these operations really just view these animals as another commodity to make themselves money. And we do see Tammy Nikita at your facility. Her original owner was a notorious animal abuser, was I think it was a meth dealer, had gun charges, had been ordered by the court to take anger management classes. And he's not uncommon. These are not isolated events. And really it's the same as the guns. It's the same as whatever else, the drugs, whatever else they're dealing in. These animals are just commodities and a way to make cash.
Yeah, and in cub petting is, a very small part of, we talked about the international wildlife trade, but we know in the United States that the international illegal trade is second to drugs in terms of legal dollars. So I think a lot of people think might be going to a small facility. There was a facility in Minnesota called Bearcat Hollow years ago that everybody thought was a small roadside zoo. Well, after investigation, they got indicted for killing and partying out more dead tigers than they ever displayed live tigers. And so you have to really question that a lot of these places are just fronts for what really is going on. And I think as a sanctuary director, the one thing we're always concerned about is the safety of ourselves, our staff, and of course the public, because not only are we maybe getting threatened that we do, but there's booby traps, or people like to set an animal, you know, they might set an animal during pickup that could get out easily if they know their animals are being seized, to make the rescuers and authorities look like we don't know what we're doing, even though it's been staged. So we have to think through every scenario, not just working with apex predators, but working with people that do have criminal backgrounds and are obviously upset that they feel their livelihood has been taken away by the Attorney General, the USDA, or the federal government. And as sanctuaries, we're there to provide quality home for the animals, and we're there to educate. But for some reason, we always get told is my animals would not get taken if there wasn't a place for them to go. Your animals would be put down, and that's not fair to the animal who's already paid a really, really horrible price for living in captivity. So yeah, I think people think we're just, they always say you have the dream job, and maybe they don't know all the facets of the dream job. I say it's not a dream job, it's the most rewarding job, but it's not all roses.
Yeah, running a sanctuary doesn't seem to be a job with a lot of vacation time.
No, we go visit other sanctuaries on vacations to learn other things.
Well, thank you so much for that. I really appreciate those insights. We have gotten a couple questions about the Big Cat Public Safety Act, what people can do, the status of it. So if you guys don't mind, I'll just spend about a minute on that and then, close out. So the Big Cat Public Safety Act, I know we've discussed it a little bit here, is a piece of federal legislation that would restrict the private ownership of big cats. It seeks to put an end to the pet trade in big cats across the US, as well as to bring an end to cub handling businesses that drive a lot of the breeding and irresponsible treatment of big cats in the US. And so if you're looking for ways to help bring an end to this problem, please do contact your members of Congress and urge them to support the Big Cat Public Safety Act. I know it doesn't sound exciting or glamorous, and I know that we're all asked all the time to contact our legislators, but it really makes all the difference in the world to hear from constituents. I'd also encourage you as a consumer, if you'd like to visit a true sanctuary, you can learn which ones fall into that category by visiting the Big Cat Sanctuary Alliance's website, or by going to the Global Federation of Animal Sanctuaries website. And both groups can help you get an idea of the sanctuaries that are truly rescuing animals, providing lifetime care, and working to bring an end to the trade in US big cats. And if you guys have anything to add to that?
I would just love to add something to the safety, which wasn't really addressed very much, during our discussion here. These are apex predators that could be, in a funky enclosure in somebody's backyard, or could be in a dilapidated roadside zoo. We're living with increasingly dangerous storms all the time. There's tornadoes and wildfires and hurricanes that are climate change driven. Having tigers all over America, not even knowing where many of them are, is a public safety issue. And that's the reason I think that this bill was dubbed the Big Cat Public Safety Act. And I think the reason it's been supported by law enforcement is because they're the ones that get the call when something happens. And I would like to read a quote by a first responder, which is really telling. First responder Edmund Kelso Jr. Is a former Marine FBI bomb expert and fireman, and he expressed his concern in a letter to Congress. What he wrote is, quote, "If I had a choice of working on an IED or responding to an emergency involving a dangerous big cat, I would definitely select the former. This should underscore how dangerous it truly is for these animals to be left in untrained hands in backyards and roadside zoos." He'd rather work on a bomb than get a call to deal with a loose tiger or big cat.
That's an excellent point. Thank you so much for that. It looks like we're just about at the end. First, thank you to our phenomenal speakers, true superstars in the effort to end the inappropriate private ownership of big cats and really make a difference for these animals in the US and abroad. And to everybody who joined us, thank you for your wonderful questions. We weren't able to get to all of them, but Heather will share follow-up contact information with you. And I think we'd be more than happy to address some of those through subsequent conversations. And finally, as a reminder, this session has been recorded. And so for those who had to drop off or would like to share it with others, it will be available later on. So thank you all so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Have a great evening, everybody. Bye.
Bye.